Hi, welcome to On Deck Bible Moments, number 7. The title today is Old and New. Today I want to talk about reading the Bible. The Bible is made up of smaller books. It's also split between the Old Testament and the New Testament. You may have asked or heard somebody else ask, why do we need the Old Testament if we have a New Testament? So it's not like when you go to get a new car and you leave the old car behind. The Old Testament is the history leading up to the New Testament, and when you read the New Testament it refers back to the Old Testament. So you obviously need the Old Testament to go back and see what the New is talking about. The Bible starts out by saying, in the beginning God created the universe. We'll stop there with that part. That would be good for another week. So in the beginning it talks about everything that started, how God created everything. Genesis and Exodus are the first two books of the Old Testament, are probably very familiar to everybody. Genesis covering Adam and Eve in the garden, Noah and the ark and the flood. Exodus, or the departure, covers the story of Moses taking the people out of Egypt. Adam and Eve were in the garden, had everything they wanted, were very blessed. They did something wrong or sinned, and they were cast out of the garden. One of my favorite jokes about Adam and Eve is that Eve would get up every morning and go over to Adam and cover his eyes and say, "Guess who?" And Adam would be really frustrated over that. You'll probably get that later in the video. But I think I was in my 30s and I heard a speaker put a little spin on that story. I'd always heard Adam, Eve, snake, sin, cast out of the garden. And he said when God came to Adam, he said, "Adam, what's going on here?" Not that God didn't know, but Adam said, "Oh, well, Eve made me eat the fruit today." And so he went over to Eve and he said, what happened? And Eve said, well, yeah, the snake made me eat the fruit. And she blamed the snake. And he said he wanted to point that out because even though the stories in the Old Testament are old stories, we still can use them today and refer to things that we go through today. So he said this is like a mother who would ask her son what happened to the plant on the front porch that's all smashed, and he would say, I don't know, go ask my sister. And she would go up and said, your brother says that you know what happened to the plant on the front porch, and she would say, maybe I saw the cat knock it over. And his point was that when we do something wrong, somebody else shouldn't be punished for it. That whether it's good or bad, we should own up to everything that we do. From Adam and Eve, we move on to the story of Noah and the ark. Noah's building this boat. His neighbors or the people around him are laughing at him because there's no water. He says, well, God told me to build the boat. If it was today that happened, we'd run into the house on social media and post pictures of the boat and Noah and his sons, and everybody would laugh and gather and point their fingers. Of course, I'm sure there was that one nice neighbor who said, just let them build the boat. Who cares if there's no water around? Everybody there was really sorry when the rain did start and the ark floated away and they didn't get to be on the boat. Genesis chapter 11 came to mind this week as I keep hearing these commercials for downloading the Babbel app. I find it interesting that you'll hear a lot of people say, well, this is a book, and the book has a bunch of old stories that we really don't need, and if somebody has a copy of it, it's probably thrown in the back of the shelf somewhere. Yet then somebody will invent something or create something and make a reference back to the Bible. So the Babbel app, as it's called, is an app that enables you to talk to people in other languages, and that came from the Bible. Because in this particular area, the people thought they were really cool, really great, how fantastic it would be to let everybody know how great they were. So they decided to build a tower up to the heavens or up to the skies. When God looked down, he realized that they were being distracted, weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing. Their whole attention was building this tower for themselves, and so he mixed up their languages and they were unable to communicate with each other. The project ended, and then the people started to disperse because they couldn't communicate. From there we move on to Exodus. We have Moses, this guy out in the country. He's hiding out. He's not much of a leader. He's not much of a speaker. This story kind of tells us that if we depend on God, God can enable us to do things that we never thought we could. Moses ends up going right to the Pharaoh, the leader in Egypt. He talks to Pharaoh. He makes speeches to Pharaoh. He ends up taking his people out of Egypt, through the wilderness, through the Red Sea. That's where the Red Sea collapses on the Egyptians. Moses had his ups and downs even after that with the mountain. That's another joke you'll get later. When Moses is up getting the 411 from God, the people are getting impatient. This teaches us to have patience. The people say, you know what, we can't depend on God. He's taken too long. Moses has taken too long. So they make an idol. They worship the idol. Eventually they get punished for that when Moses comes down. And God also reminds them that this whole trip has been to get to the Promised Land. The Promised Land is a land that's this great land. The farming's going to be easy. There's lots of crops and plenty to eat. But he said when you go into the Promised Land, these people that are in there already have all these idols. I mean, they had idols. You go to pray to this idol for rain. You go to pray to this idol to have good crops. And he knew that his people, God's people, would eventually get distracted again. They would spend too much time trying to cover all their bases by running around to all these idols. They would waste their time making idols and statues, unless they had some kind of statue and idol outlet that we don't know about, where you could just go buy one. Maybe they had it in Rehoboth. Rehoboth is mentioned in the Old Testament. This reminds me of modern day people who they'll walk into a store and see a stuffed animal, and they'll say, wow, look, that's my favorite animal. I'm going to buy that stuffed animal. And they get home and they find out the company makes like 542 different stuffed animals. And they say, wouldn't it be neat to collect them all? And they start spending their money. They start wasting their time. They're on the internet. They're running from store to store until they have all 542. Are they happy that they completed the collection? Does the happiness last? Not really. I always find it interesting when you see somebody with a collection, you say, wow, that's a nice collection, and they might go back to that first one that they bought, and they'll show you that one. They're really still interested in the one that they really wanted. And God was trying to tell them, in order to be happy when you go into the Promised Land, that you should really have only one God. There's law books, there's accounting books, there's family trees in the Old Testament. I'm reminded, since we just watched the spaceship take off into space this past week, in 2 Kings, I believe it is, Elijah gets into a chariot of fire, and it takes off right into heaven, takes him up there. It kind of reminds me of the space flight. There's Daniel in the lion's den. He was probably the OT Lion King TV series back then. Jonah in the whale, but there's more to the story after Jonah gets out of the whale. Here's something that nobody ever taught me. I was always thinking when I read the Old Testament, it was kind of exclusive to Israel, Jerusalem, to that area. But some of the references in the Old Testament mention places that are now associated with Germany, Denmark. I never knew that until I started to research a little bit more. The word Nimrod, which we use today as a slur or to put somebody down, geek, foolish, it kind of means today, that comes from the Bible. Nimrod meant great hunter. There's a great story in 1 Kings with Elijah, the guy with the chariot, when Elijah versus the false prophets. It's one on like 100, and it's like a modern-day smackdown match. There's a Hallmark Channel story in the Old Testament. Stay with me on this one. In the book of Ruth, Naomi, her 2 sons pass away and her husband passes away, and she has 2 daughter-in-laws. So all the men have died, and the daughter-in-laws want to go back with Naomi, who wants to return to her country. Naomi says, you don't have to go, and the one daughter-in-law goes, yep, see you later. She runs back the other way. But Ruth says, no, you're family. I want to be loyal to my family, and I want to go with you. When they get back to the country, there's 2 possible husbands. and Ruth ends up marrying just one in the end of the story. There's fights over inheritance. Jacob and Esau. Jacob fools his father into giving him Esau's inheritance. Esau gets mad and goes off. Jacob's mom was in on it, so it's kind of a conspiracy story. Later, Jacob gets his when someone pulls the old switcheroo on him, and I'm sure at that point he felt like, well, I guess this is what it feels like at the end of that when you do somebody wrong. This happens in the New Testament. We'll discuss that next week about the prodigal son. There's the great nation of Israel, and then it's split into kingdoms. That may appeal to some of you who like TV shows about kingdoms. One big lesson in the Old Testament, or the theme throughout, is that if you stay close to God and you follow Him, you'll be victorious. When you don't follow just God, you'll be defeated, and the blessings will cease. There were some things I was never taught, and I guess with the modern day books that we have and different things I've been able to look up, I was always confused when Moses led the people out of Egypt through the wilderness and they get to the promised land. Who were the people in the promised land? I mean, I got there was God's people, and God's people were taken into slavery in Egypt, and they got out of Egypt, but who were all these people in this land that God wanted to give them? Well, when Noah got off the boat, he had his 3 sons with him. One of the sons strayed, and from his lineage, or his family tree, became the Canaanites and the Amorites. When Esau got mad at his brother, he went off and he started to marry several women. He decided to go against God's plans and God's laws, and from him we get the Amalekites. I often wonder what Esau would have thought if his wrongdoings had actually led to the death of his own people. I would suggest today that you find a Bible and read it by story. You find the book that has Noah in it. You read the story about Noah. You check in on Joseph. Joseph is the guy who was sold into slavery, thought all was lost because his brothers had did that to him, and Joseph ends up being in charge of his brother's fate. Joseph's father was also responsible for the 12 tribes of Israel. There's many books to read. The one that I keep mentioning is the Good News Bible that I use. When you open that up, at the beginning of the chapter, it tells you what the story is in that chapter. There's companions to the Bible books, where you can look up, for instance, Jesus. It refers to all the different places you can read about him. It tells you about him in there. Some Bibles, when you open it, tells you just about the stories and how to look them up right in the front of it. Some will follow through with you as you read through the Bible. You can look up verses, and then below it explains the verses to you. I've always found that that's a better way to read the Old Testament. There are plans that say, wouldn't you like to read the Old Testament, New Testament within a year, but I always find that, or I've always felt like that feels like you take an hour-long TV show that you like and try and watch only 8 or 9 minutes a day. By the time the week's over, you're not sure where that story was going or what actually happened, because you lose track of what's going on in there. One time I was trying to explain something to someone, and I asked my daughter to draw me a picture. And the picture had 2 bookshelves. One bookshelf was crammed solid with books, and the other one just had the Bible on it. And I was trying to explain how important it was to read the Bible and not get distracted. Reference books they're good if you have a question, but you can spend your whole life reading that bookshelf that's crammed full of reference books and people's opinions about the Bible, and not really get the directions that we need from God by just concentrating on the Bible itself. God wants us to read the Bible to get the instructions needed to follow Him. Sometimes we'll feel unnoticed doing God's work, but there's thousands of people in the Bible that aren't mentioned. But they did follow His instructions, and the only way that they got those instructions and found out what they were supposed to be doing for God was to read the book. Like I said, next week we'll look at the New Testament, and I hope this helped everybody. God bless. See you next week.